On the morning of November 20, 2018, twin columns of smoke rose over the skies of Monmouth County, New Jersey. Within a span of 8 hours, fires broke out at the homes of two brothers living just miles apart. The first emergency response came at 5:01 a.m. at Paul Caneiro's residence in Ocean Township. First responders arrived to find the rear of the house ablaze, but Paul, his wife, and their 2 adult daughters were already sitting safely in a car in the driveway. Everyone made it out without a scratch. The second scene, discovered hours later at the sprawling Colts Neck estate of Paul's younger brother, Keith Caneiro, offered no such relief. Firefighters found Keith's body on the front lawn. Inside the smoldering mansion, they recovered the bodies of his wife, Jennifer, and their 2 young children, 11-year-old Jesse and 8-year-old Sophia. Detectives were left to weigh 2 conflicting possibilities. Either a coordinated, violent outside force had systematically targeted the family, or one of these crime scenes was a meticulously staged diversion. In the pre-dawn hours of November 20th, with 2 houses burning and a family of 4 dead, Monmouth County was looking for a perpetrator who had either traveled between the 2 homes in total silence or had lived among the victims all along. The timeline of that morning began to fracture when investigators reviewed digital evidence. Hours before the murders took place, surveillance records showed Paul Caneiro in his own garage, manually pulling a cable from his security system, plunging his own property into darkness. Meanwhile, at the Colts Neck estate, a sequence of extreme violence unfolded. Keith was ambushed and shot 5 times on his front lawn. The attacker then moved inside, using a knife and a gun to execute Jennifer, before repeatedly stabbing the 2 children. To erase the evidence, the killer ignited a slow-burn fire in the basement, designed to smolder for hours before neighbors would notice the smoke. The diversionary tactic fell apart back in Paul's own driveway. Investigators examining his property found brown staining on the hood of his white Porsche Macan. The stains indicated spot-pour burn patterns, and accelerant-sniffing dogs detected gasoline. The Ocean Township fire had been intentionally set. A search of Paul's basement yielded the murder weapon, hidden deep inside a pile of debris. Detectives recovered a 9mm Sig Sauer handgun. Ballistics technicians confirmed this specific firearm matched the spent shell casings found scattered on the grass near Keith Caneiro's body. This diagram illustrates the biological evidence recovered from that same debris pile. Forensic analysts tested a pair of black nitrile gloves and found a distinct mixture of DNA. The profiles belonged to Paul Caneiro and his murdered 8-year-old niece, Sophia. Paul set the fire at his own home as a ruse to present himself as a fellow target, but his arrogant assumption that he could outsmart arson investigators backfired. Instead of destroying the evidence, he preserved a direct physical roadmap to his guilt. The physical evidence answered how the crime occurred, but the motive lay in the stark contrast between the brothers' lives. Keith was a highly successful, self-made entrepreneur with a growing technology consulting firm. Paul had suffered severe injuries in a past car accident, rendering him disabled and entirely dependent on a salary drawn from Keith's businesses. Despite his dependence, Paul maintained an expensive facade. Financial investigators discovered he owed heavy back taxes to the IRS and was managing 2 separate mortgages. Yet he continued to project extreme wealth, paying for luxury items including leases on 3 different Porsches. Psychologists describe a phenomenon known as narcissistic injury, when someone with a fragile, inflated sense of self faces a severe threat to their public image. The resulting shame can trigger intense, destructive rage. For Paul, that threat materialized the day before the murders. This flowchart maps out the financial catalyst. It shows how over 2 years, Paul systematically siphoned $78,000 from an irrevocable trust account meant to protect Keith's children. On November 19th, Keith discovered the missing funds and confronted his brother. Keith's next move was an email threatening to cut off his brother's $225,000 salary. But Paul was also the sole trustee of a life insurance policy on Keith. If Keith and his immediate family were wiped out, that policy would yield a massive $1.5 million payout. Staring down the peril of public exposure, the loss of his high-status lifestyle, and total financial ruin, Paul made his choice. He opted to annihilate his brother's family rather than face personal accountability. In the immediate aftermath, Paul's behavior was unsettling. During initial police interviews, detectives noted his emotionless, stone-faced demeanor as he attempted to play the role of a grieving survivor who had narrowly escaped a phantom assassin. When the case finally went to trial in early 2026, the defense team mounted a desperate strategy. They attempted to deflect the blame entirely away from Paul, pointing the finger at Corey, the youngest of the three Caneiro brothers, and arguing that police had developed tunnel vision. The prosecution dismantled that theory piece by piece. They used the irrefutable physical record, the digital footprint of Paul disabling his camera system, the ballistics match, and the DNA of his murdered niece hidden in his own basement to prove that only one man was responsible. The physical evidence secured a conviction, but the psychological horror remains difficult to process. Stabbing an 8-year-old child 17 times requires an incomprehensible level of emotional detachment, especially when the killer is their own uncle. The murders at Colts Neck proved that a 6-figure salary and luxury cars aren't always signs of success. Sometimes they are the overhead of a desperate entitlement that, when threatened, can turn into psychopathic violence against the people sitting at the family